This is Myster Media. Today we're going to talk about psyche and drugs. We have with us in the studio Dr. Siddharta Kauffman, who is a psychiatrist from the United States. Hello, Sid.
Hi.
Nice to have you here. So, tell us a little bit about you have any experiences with drugs?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a unique experience, but it's a pretty common experience to most psychiatrists who are working these days. I've been a psychiatrist since 1962, but haven't worked continuously. And now I'm working part-time in, that is for some months, in hospitals in America. I'm licensed in 5 different states, and I tend to work in different places. And about 25% of the patients that you see have some kind of drug problem that they're coming in with.
But that means they have a real addiction. It's a problem you call an addiction.
Yes, or a problem from drugs that affect other things, like they may be using drugs and also are depressed and suicidal, and I may be treating them for their suicidality. And at the same time focusing their drugs. I'm not a specialist in just dealing with only people who are coming in for addiction. But there are, addiction places where people come in strictly and that's their only problem is addiction. Usually when I'm treating them, there's some psychiatric overlay, some psychiatric problem that's coming from the drugs.
I heard that with some children, like psychosis is a very common problem after drug use. Can you talk a little bit about what psychosis is and what the manifestations are?
I mean, psychosis is a term to mean a break in contact with reality primarily. And mostly when you're talking about psychosis, we're talking about either schizophrenia or manic depressive illness. And you have common things like delusions where, people are saying I'm Napoleon or Jesus or something, and that are gross delusions, and hallucinations can come, especially in an acute phase with some psychedelic drugs and some other drugs, where you're seeing things that aren't there, primarily hearing things that aren't there. Hearing things that aren't there is more common just with pure schizophrenia.
My children are going to use drugs. My children in the age of 15, 16, 17 years. How, as a parent, how do I recognize my children are not telling me that they're using drugs? How am I going to recognize that my children are on drugs? Is there signs or?
Well, I mean, the primary, from my sense of it, the primary problem is your relationship with your children. That's the first indication. If you have not a good relationship with your child and there's a lot of walls built up and a lot of mistrust, it's much more difficult to tell. And basically that's a major symptom that's going to probably lead them into serious drug use. So the primary thing is basically keep a healthy relationship with your kids, some kind of mutual trust. And if that's starting to break down in some way, maybe that's a time to seek therapy, especially in the early stages.
But are there any signs like concentration problems, hyperactivity?
Yeah, you have subtle and you have gross changes. I mean, you basically are going to notice that the kid's schoolwork is going to deteriorate. His relationships with his peers are going to deteriorate. He's going to get into kind of disciplinary problems in school. His personality will change around the house, much more irritable or silent or withdrawn.
Yeah, so you can also but then when your child is in puberty, you might think my child is in puberty. I mean, that's the kind of similar problems. How do children relate to like this whole thing with drugs and peers? Children are in a group environment, the other kids are using drugs. How am I as a mother? How am I going to relate to my child and help him to resist or work with the fact that his peers might drive him into drug use?
Well, I don't have teenage children, and I'm not a specialist really in adolescent psychiatry, but primarily common sense is the best guide. Basically, if the parent has a good relationship with the child, fairly healthy, every once in a while you have a laugh together and he's showing you something of his schoolwork and this and this. If you have a good relation, it's very likely he's going to have sort of good relations with his peers. If the relationship between the parents and the child deteriorate, you're already on dangerous grounds, whether it's with drugs or with anything else. And it's hard for me to conceive that if a child's having a pretty healthy relationship with his parents, the teenagers or his peers are going to drive him into, serious disabling drug use. There will be some experimentation probably, and there's a need for teenagers to be somewhat rebellious. So I guess in a way it's, probably it's probably good that he has something to rebel against a little bit. Most kids just rebel in some ways, small ways, and nothing too bad. But your relationship with the child is the primary thing. Noticing, his relationship with other kids, his schoolwork in general. I mean, if you've got a child that's been beaten down or feels very inferior and he's withdrawn, and he's not able to relate to children very well even before he took drug use, such a child's more easily going to be influenced, and somebody's going to come along and say drugs, and he's going to feel like this is a sense of religion or belonging to him or something much more significant than just a small experience.
What I wonder is like how dangerous are drugs? You have the hard drugs, and I think the step towards hard, is there an easy step over to hard drugs? Once you go into soft drugs, you go experience with soft drugs, go into hard drugs, because of course that's what most of the parents are afraid of.
Well, my experience is that not so many people go from soft drugs into hard drugs, and what exactly was your question again?
Well, the danger. I was wondering about the danger of drugs, of soft drugs. What is in reality the danger of soft drugs?
Well, anything that can do you any good in this world can also do you some harm. So, soft drugs are generally mildly not so dangerous.
Is it being unprepared for the experience, the inner experience?
If somebody's very unstable and he gets drunk, something bad may happen. So basically, it's a general rule: don't play around with anything new or experimental or anything if you're not feeling in a stable or pretty strong situation. If you're feeling like you're just about ready to lose it completely and you're feeling bad, and this is not a very good time to have even a few beers, basically. So all drugs can be somewhat dangerous. If we're talking about marijuana or hashish as soft drugs, primarily it tends to make people slightly more conscious, more aware. That's the general reason why people take it, and they have some pleasure in it. So you become more aware of the taste of peanut butter, and you think, oh great, peanut butter's great, and you become more aware of the sound of music, and so you enjoy hearing music. But if you're also feeling very paranoid and frightened and sad, you also become more aware of feeling frightened and paranoid and sad. And for most people, becoming more aware of it makes them even more scared.
What is like a trace of paranoia? What is the main quality of paranoia?
The paranoia is fear without a specific object in mind. A general sense of fear that somebody out there is trying to hurt me, but without, as opposed to somebody's threatened you and you're afraid of that person, that wouldn't be paranoia. But if I just have a fear like, I think somebody out there wants to hurt me, if it's just a feeling, it's a kind of a paranoid feeling. If it becomes an idea that there is some group out there ready to get me and there's no basis in reality to it, then you have a more serious illness, paranoid. Otherwise, almost we all have some paranoid feelings once in a while.
But those are specifically the feelings which are coming up with the use of hashish or weed or marijuana.
It's coming up all the time, with or without it. The drug, I mean, it has many effects. I mean, sometimes you feel a little, your body is tired and it's hard to work, but primarily it's a consciousness drug, and yogis and seekers after truth have been using it for many years, especially in India and places, to help find out who they are. So even if one is paranoid, if one is a sort of seeker after truth and wanting to see what's the source of this fears in me and paranoia in me, and use these drugs, in that regard, in a way, it becomes therapeutic. By becoming more aware of it, and you can see where the source of it is, you may be able to, transcend it. So, in the right hands, using these drugs can be very beneficial.
But children, for example, don't know all those things. They don't know about paranoia. They don't know about psychosis. So they use it with groups of children, and there's no guidance.
Well, obviously, the earlier is a little bit more dangerous, but even so, I mean, all children are not the same. So even all 20-year-olds are not the same, all 15-year-olds are not the same, all 10-year-olds. Some are, pretty mature people and some not. Not that, one would tend to recommend it, but, some child at 8 can drink a beer probably and not be affected that much, and other ones would be really out of it. Children at least know the word fear. They don't know paranoia, but they know fear and they know crazy. So they don't have to know the word psychosis. And knowing these words really doesn't help. They're just intellectual conceptions.
The combination of alcohol and drugs, I mean, it happens quite a lot.
In small moderations, probably not so terrible. One smokes a joint and drinks a beer, and one is pretty solid on the ground and knows and paying the rent and showing up at work on time. It's probably not a problem. Alcohol has an opposite effect of marijuana. Alcohol tends to make you more uninhibited. Mm-hmm. So alcohol is useful for people who are a little bit shy, and you have a couple of drinks and you feel like dancing and being a little wilder than you normally would be. Or you may be shy to approach a woman or a man, and you have a couple of drinks, you say things you might not otherwise say, and that sometimes may be useful. So you become uninhibited a little bit.
So what is the difference then, you become more, what is the difference between, you have the alcohol, people who are high on alcohol, there's a different behavior, and there's a different behavior on people who are high on ecstasy.
You're asking me to compare...
extremes, huh? In extremes. So you're high on alcohol or you're high on ecstasy. Mm-hmm.
What's the difference if you're taking too much alcohol as opposed to taking too much ecstasy? alcohol in the early stages will make you pretty uninhibited. If you take too much of alcohol, it operates as like a sleeping pill. You know, we used to use it in surgery in the old days when we didn't have anesthesia to get people so drunk that they just really conked out and went unconscious that we could do surgery on them. So it depends how much that's happened with it. But, you know, you can see in American cities in some places where you have Skid Row and people just sort of lying around in a kind of a torpor and stuporous state without any motivation and like that. So that's the situation generally with too much alcohol. It's addictive. It's readily available. It's cheap and you know.
Okay. So you have the first stage is inhibition. Then you can block people out. But there's also another phase where people get into very aggressive. So how is that state of mind? How come people get to this intense aggression? What is the state of mind?
Well, if they're getting very aggressive, it's not that it's not like a normal stage of at least in my experience of alcohol, that people naturally get to that stage. I mean, if I would drink enough, I would get uninhibited. I'd drink more and more and more. I'd get very sleepy and stuporous and fall over. And people that are getting very, very angry, that anger must be in them in the first place. And we have a lot of suppressed angers and rages and stuff in us. Sometimes people drink because they're tired of suppressing this anger, you know, and so you get the first stages where people are just sarcastic like anything and irritable and that sort of thing. And in the later stages, this anger and rage is coming out more violently and aggressively and everything. But with all these drugs, nothing's going to happen a whole lot that's not in the person. So like a psychosis has to be there in a seed, as a seed? Well, you know, psychiatrists and myself also will say almost we're all psychotic in one level. There's a schizophrenia in all of us, covered over by a kind of a mask of civilization and organizing. You see it with travelers all the time. If they're in Holland, they sort of act Dutch. Mm-hmm. And if they're in Italy, they're more Italian. And, you know, we tend to be products of society looking for approval and acceptance, and we feel it, yeah. Okay, but what is it that, for example, what triggers a psychosis? We have it all in us, but what triggers it? Anything can trigger it. Mm-hmm. Psychosis means a break with reality. Okay, but explain the break with reality. I mean, this is reality. We sit here right now. For example, when I would go in a psychosis, what would happen to me? I would have a break with reality, but what would that mean? Well, you know, break with reality can be as crazy as, you know, jumping off a high building thinking you can fly. I mean, that's a pretty heavy break with reality. Okay. Small break with reality can be, you know, just taking down your pants in public or something and walking around, or going to a restaurant and having food and that's just walking out and saying, charge it, or, you know, that you're feeling that you're more important than you really are, and, you know, or... So breaks in realities come also in various sizes and shapes. Mm-hmm. One can say, I believe I'm Jesus Christ. And one can say, I believe I'm Jesus Christ. So, you know, one's a little scarier to deal with than the other. And usually, if people have a break with reality, it's usually causing some problem to other people. Is it happening more with drugs? Breaks with reality? Drugs can certainly speed up that process or break it. And also it depends, part of the motivation for taking the drugs, just like part of the motivation for taking alcohol. I mean, thousands and thousands of people enjoy wine with their food and beers, and they don't break with reality. But if you're feeling that there's let's say you have a sexual problem with your wife, and you don't want to admit it to yourself, and you're not dealing with it, and you just start drinking and you're not dealing with it, or you start taking drugs, I mean, that source, that cause of the problem.
Would that be, for example, you would use drugs, would the sexual problem easier to be solved with drugs?
Well, that's why people sort of take it, because, for example, like we were saying with alcohol, people are a little bit more uninhibited. So if people are shy or like that, so sometimes they can perform a little bit better with a beer or a little wine or something.
So they have an inhibition.
Well, this is...
Give me an example of a sexual inhibition. What could be? What are the possibilities?
Well, I mean, sexual inhibition can be anything. I mean, if you're talking, somebody has a problem getting an erection or having performance sexually, and if he's, normally we all have some problems, but if the person is, and normally people are willing to take a little bit of a look at it and everything and use a little, maybe they experiment a little bit with drugs, but if it's a big problem, not being able to get erection, and it's also he's got a big problem in being able to trust anybody to talk about it and can't go into therapy about it and doesn't like to admit it to himself and block it out, and every time he sees a woman who's a potential partner or something like that, he gets feeling jealous and angry, and this thing can really build up, and he feels there's no way out. And
you better go to your psychiatrist and talk about it.
Obviously, just like any medical illness, you want to catch it as early as possible. But if you leave a serious psychological problem and don't look at it, and something is feeding it, so that it's creating more and more frustration, more and more upset, and the person can't find any way out of it, that's when the breaks in reality is going to occur.
Yeah.
I mean, a girl told me a good example, a friend of mine, that when she was younger, she was in school, and
if you treat people after a bad trip, people have bad trips.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of treatment do you give? What is the treatment?
Primarily, a bad trip is only a reflection of what's in the person anyhow. If they have great relationships with their parents and great relationships with their friends, and they had motivation and doing well in school, and they were basically fairly healthy people, and they just happen to get a hold of some really bad street drug or something that's really contaminated in some way. Sometimes that can happen, just like, what happened, you get food poisoning or something. You go to a nice restaurant, you get something, completely the problem is from the outside. That bad trip will probably go away on its own pretty quickly. You just want to basically make them calm and give a little reassurance and tell them this is just something temporary, like the flu. It's going to go away in a couple days. Take a couple aspirin, drink lots of fluids, and don't do anything very upsetting and mild. It goes away easily. So you've got the simple side of it.
Are there special antidepressives and medicines?
Well, if somebody,
vitamins, for example?
Well, vitamins are good.
Oh, it's always good.
Vitamins are always good. It's always best to do the least intrusive methods. Vitamins are good.
Which are the least intrusive?
Well, vitamins, for example, are the least intrusive. I mean, but if if somebody's acutely psychotic on psychedelics or whatever, and they come in the emergency room this way, well, then you have to give them what they call antipsychotic medicine. So, for example, you give
you mentioned
Thorazine.
Aspirin?
Aspirin is very, is the Band-Aid, So if you have a small cut with your child, you kiss it and, you put a little teeny bandage, you give them an aspirin. But if you got a heavy cut, then you got to do major surgery. So it depends how you have to assess the person, how, and sometimes you can't in the first few hours. Somebody's in a bad trip, so you basically do supportive methods.
Like?
Don't let them hurt themselves or other people. If you can restrain them by just holding them, or
taking away the sharp things out of the room.
Taking away the sharp things, sitting there with them. I mean, reassuring them, playing some nice music, some soft music. Keeping the lights a little bit gentle, and just trying to talk them down. That's the least intrusive methods. If that doesn't work, and they're openly violent and panicky, and you can't talk to them, then you're going to have to give them an injection of.
You also give them baths, for example. You also give them.
If that's possible, a nice warm bath is very nice. So that's all the supportive sort of things. What's available.
You're referring to an injection or giving injection. What kind of injections do you apply?
Well, I'm talking because when I see them in an emergency room in a hospital, usually they're in the worst shape. There's not just supportive methods they're going to do, or they wouldn't have gotten to me. So I see people who are, openly violent and maybe, waving a gun around or threatening somebody with a knife, and and not trusting anybody, and very, very aggressive. Such a person, you have to give them major tranquilizers, which we call like antipsychotic medicines. Haldol is a classic medicine. Thorazine's classic medicine.
Does that happen? Doesn't happen very often that people get into almost first aid in a hospital. How do you call it?
No, it must be pretty rare. But I mean, statistics. It's hard to really because if 10,000 people take an acid trip, I mean, there's nobody around to monitor all the ones that just had a little bit of an upset stomach, and threw up in the bathroom, and then they felt better, as opposed to the ones that ended up in the emergency room. You just see ones that end up in the emergency room. So there's some. I mean, and I'm not so familiar,
Do they do a checkup? For example, a person comes in and is totally upset and with guns. Do they do a checkup as a doctor, as the person used drugs at that particular time?
Yeah, pretty commonly. If somebody comes in that's, very aggressive and out of control and sort of wild, and it's very hard to talk to them, and it's very hard to know this is a psychosis. Because what we really tend to call psychosis is not sort of drug-induced. There's a drug-induced kind of psychosis, so we want to distinguish, is this just due to LSD and it's going to get better in a day, or is this just without the drugs and everything? So it's frequently, commonly in the emergency room, you do a lot of blood testing and everything, and you may do a blood drug test to see anything in the system. Even might have gotten in and he didn't know about it. So if you can detect, there's some LSD in the urine, and the patient, I didn't take any, then this is a good reason why he went. It has a better prognosis, in other words.
Yeah.
So that's, useful medically, because if it's the person didn't just sort of break down, things were going pretty good, and somebody just threw a lot of bad medicine in his coffee cup, which could happen, and the person didn't know about it and he's not expecting it, of course it's going to have a more shocking, profound effect, and he may...
And nobody can tell anybody else around that he has used any drugs.
He might not know it himself. I mean, if you're talking about such an example, then you have to detect it in the urine and in the...
But how do you detect it in the behavior? For example, this happens a lot with children. They go to a disco, they get a pill, and they don't know about it, and suddenly they behave very badly or strange.
The same way. I mean, if it's a mild, difficult behavior, maybe, you think it's something they ate, you don't know, and maybe it's not so heavy that you need to take them into the emergency room. But if the behavior is to a certain level where the kids throwing chairs around the room, something's heavy happening, it's not easy to talk them, they'll end up in an emergency room. And if he's in an emergency room...
Is there like a first aid, like you give him always a lot of water, or you set him down on the floor and you hold him, or...
Well, the first step is to see if you can make contact. Emotional hello, are you there, and how are you feeling, and see if you can get some relationship. If that's not happening, the person's not relating, then that's a sign that the situation's, fairly serious. If he's just sort of withdrawn, and I mean, of course, also depends how old a child you're talking about. obviously, the younger, the more dangerous it is. Just like with temperature, a couple degrees of temperature in a baby is very serious, whereas in a 6 or 7-year-old, it's not so serious.
So you take their temperature? That is something you do?
Well, you might also. I mean, if a child's just withdrawn and looking funny, you would likely take their temperature and feel their body and see what's happening. Maybe they've gotten a little. It's hard to tell. I mean, just if somebody put a small amount of LSD in their formula or something, or if they've got a small virus in their system, you're not going to be able to tell much. You're not going to be able to tell a difference. You have to tell it laboratory.
Is there? Can you make a difference? Like, for example, you see the child; it's very upset. You can somehow detect if it has used ecstasy, LSD, or marijuana, or some other pills. Is there differences you can?
Well, I mean, there's definite differences in the effects it has on people, especially grown-up people. But with street drugs, you never can tell because, somebody may have mixed things up a little bit to make some money, so you don't know. I mean, somebody mixed arsenic with the LSD or with the ecstasy, and you can't tell. Usually, ecstasy is a little bit more predictable. You either feel happy or you feel really miserable.
Or hibernating, or you...
When it first comes.
If you don't have enough
It doesn't
fluid?
seem to affect the thinking process as strong as the LSD. But I haven't specifically done research on it. This is just what I've observed from my living situations and around and everything. That even in in people that are experimenting with ecstasy, they call it ecstasy because they feel ecstatic for a time.
Hoe belangrijk is het? How important? I'm sorry. How important is it that the people who are around that person who have seen the breaking down or had the upsetness to tell the people who pick up the person, the GG and GD in Holland, we have this first aid cars, and how important is that you tell those people in order to save a life, maybe? Or?
Well, I mean, it's hard to imagine where it's a completely life-threatening situation to tell, but it certainly would be much better for the treatment and much faster if the patient had said, hey, he got some bad acid at this party, and now he's, knocked it, he's looking weird and out and unconscious in some way. That certainly, alerts the medical staff very fast. And if they have no idea what it can be, because there's 10,000 illnesses and 10,000 things can go wrong, did this person have magnesium poisoning, inject lead, is he schizophrenic, is he come out of the psychiatric hospital? I mean, all these possibilities exist, and it's obviously best to narrow it down and to know what's happening. And this is also compassionate, nice behavior to let these things be known.
So good for friends to know this and help out. Just be able to observe very clearly your friends and your peers, and then if something happens, you can be around.
Yeah. It's really hard to talk totally in general because cases are different really individually, but generally you see personality changes and behavior changes that are obvious, and if they persist, and this is just like we get pains in our shoulders once in a while, and we think, I don't know, maybe I turned, but if it stays for a few days, you think maybe it's something more serious. This is the same.
Okay, thank you, Sid. This is going to be very helpful for all parents and children
Great.
who see this. Okay.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right.